The way you talk about God has convinced and will continue to convince some percentage of humanity that it's fine to hold on to this old sort of God, this God that can hear prayers and they can intervene or not in the lives of human beings. And as we've begun to explore, I think there are a lot of problems with that kind of belief. If nothing else, there are many such gods on offer, and devotion to them becomes irreconcilable among true believers. And my concern is that you could do exactly what you do with religion with astrology, right? It would be no more legitimate to obfuscate the boundary between clear thinking and superstition there, because this traditional God and the doctrines that support him are on no firmer ground than astrology is now today. And astrology, you could almost everything you say about religion, it's the fact that it has organized human thinking for thousands of years, that it's a cultural universal, that every group of people has given rise to some form of it, that it has archetypal significance, that it has powerful stories. All of that can be said about astrology. And in fact, some additional things can be said about astrology that would argue in its favor. For instance, astrology is profoundly egalitarian. There's no bad zodiac sign. Whoever you are, everyone's got a great zodiac sign, and it's just an inconvenient fact of the discipline that if I read you Charles Manson's horoscope, 95% of the audience would find it relevant, and that's how easily falsifiable astrology is. But my concern is that we could live in a world where societies are shattered over things like different zodiac interpretations. And we don't live in that world for good reason, because we have beaten astrology into submission. And I would say that religion, in terms of revealed religion and belief in a personal God, is, over the centuries, getting the same treatment by science and rationality, and should be. And it is a perverse circumstance that we live in a world that is shattered by religion. Yeah.
So I think what I'll do first is adopt the exceptionally difficult and likely counterproductive position of saying something not so much in defense of religion, but in defense of astrology, knowing full well that that's fundamentally a fool's errand. But there's something I want to point out, is that, first of all, astrology was astronomy in its nascent form. And astrology was also science in its nascent form, just like alchemy was chemistry in its nascent form. And so sometimes you have to dream a crazy dream with all of the error that crazy dream entails, because you have an intuition that there's something there to motivate you to develop the intuition to the point where it actually becomes of genuine practical utility. Now, when we look back on the astrologers and we view their contributions to the history of the world with contempt, we should also remember that the people who built Stonehenge, for example, and the first people who determined that our fates were in part written in the stars, were people whose astrological beliefs were indistinguishable from their astronomical beliefs. And you might think, well, in what sense is your fate written in the stars? And I would say it's certainly the case insofar as there are such things as cosmic regularities. So it was the dream of astrology that there was some relationship between the movement of the planetary bodies and the fixed stars and human destiny, and that's what drove us to build the first astronomical observatories, and to also determine that there was a proper time for planting and a proper time for harvesting, and a way of orienting yourself in the world, for example, by using the North Star. It's also the poetic ground that enabled us to identify the notion that you could look up and orient yourself towards the heavens, and that there was a metaphorical relationship between that and positioning yourself properly in life. And at a deeper level, the cosmos was the place that the human imaginative drama was externalized and draped itself out into the world as something that was essentially observable, so that we could derive great orienting fictions from the observation of our imagination. And so part of the problem that Sam is pointing to is the difficulty of distinguishing valid poetic impulse from invalid poetic impulse, and that really is a tremendous problem. You see that arise also in people who have religious delusions attendant upon manic depressive disorder or schizophrenia. But so much of what eventually manifests itself as hardcore pragmatic scientific belief has its origin in wild flights of poetic fantasy. And it's also the case, by the way, that that's actually how your brain is organized, as far as I can tell, that when you, and it isn't just me, there's a very large, what would you call it, research literature outlining the relative functions of the right and left hemisphere, and it certainly appears to be the case that when we encounter something absolutely unknowable or unknown, what we do is drape that unknown thing in fantasy as a first pass approximation to the truth, and then refine that fantasy as a consequence of iterative critical analysis. And so Sam believes that what should happen is that the poetic and fictional domain should be supplanted by the rational domain.
Let me just close the loop there. Not okay. Quite. I think we need poetry and fiction, and there's more to engaging with reality than being a scientist in a white lab coat. But we need to be able to clearly distinguish fact from fantasy, or fact from merely fertile flights of the imagination. And we want to be rigorous there and rational there. And it's not that there's no place for mere creativity that's not on the rails of rationality.
Well, look, fair enough then, but I mean then partly what we are disputing is the relative import and of those two domains. Let's say the poetic and the fictional and the rational.
And the status of religion now in that.
Well, I have a hard time reconciling that to some degree with your more what would you say, formal statements about the problem, because your mechanism, the mechanism that you put forth above all, outside of truth, is rationality. And it isn't clear to me if you're willing to allow the utility of spiritual experience, which you do, and if you're willing to make, what would you say, allowances for the necessity of the poetic imagination, exactly how it is that is also encapsulated under the rubric of pure rationality. See, and here's something, you can tell me what you think about this, and I've been thinking a lot about what Sam and I have been talking about, by the way. So I'm making the case in my writing that democratic institutions not only grew out of the Judeo-Christian substrate, but that they're properly ensconced within that substrate. But I'm also perfectly aware that not every religious or poetic system gives rise to democratic institutions, first, and also that there are Christian substructures, maybe the most obviously in the case of the Russian Orthodox Church, right, where the same metaphysical principles apply, but out of which a democracy did not emerge. And so it does seem to me that what we have in the West is the consequence of the interplay between the fantasy-predicated, poetic Judeo-Christian tradition and the rational critique that was aimed at that by the Enlightenment figures. And that seems to me to mirror something like the proper balance between the right hemisphere and its poetic imagination and the left hemisphere and its critical capacity. And then I would say that part of the way, so one of the questions you brought up was, how do we decide which, let's say, religious intuitions are valid? And I think we do that in part through negotiated agreement, because people have, look, even among the Catholics, say in the medieval time, there was an absolute horror of heresy. So if you were some mendicant monk and you had a profound religious vision, the probability that you were going to be tried as a heretic and burnt at the stake was extremely high, because even the gatekeepers of the religious tradition realized that religious revelation untrammeled by something like community dialogue, something like that, was something of extraordinary danger. And so I would agree with you that the poetic imagination and the ground of religious revelation is something that can lead people dangerously astray. But I would say at the same time that it constitutes the grounds of our initial exploration, and that it's actually ineradicably necessary.
Okay, well, I'll briefly address that, and then I want to ask a question that brings Douglas directly in here. I think this is an instance of what's called the genetic fallacy, the idea that because something emerged the way it did historically, as a matter of historical contingency, it is good. The origin is in fact good and worth maintaining, or that it was in fact necessary, that we couldn't get these good things like democracy any other way, or were unlikely to. And I would say that there's no Abrahamic religion that is the best conceivable womb of democracy or anything else we like, science.
That's a great place to get Douglas involved.
Yeah. So, but I would just add one other category of thinking here. We have what we think is factual and methods by which we derive facts. I would put rationality there and an empirical engagement with reality. Then we have other good things in life, like fiction and flights of fancy that are pleasing for one reason or another and could be generative toward the first category. But then we also have, I would acknowledge, and we've spoken about this before, useful fictions and cases, I would hope rare cases where fiction is more adaptive or more useful than the truth, right? That sometimes the truth can be not worth knowing. And I would argue that there are those cases,
okay,
but they're few and far between.
We should focus on that to some degree.
Yeah, so I wanted to just point to Douglas here and focus on that, because I think your fear, Douglas, is that my style, or Richard Dawkins' style, or Christopher Hitchens' style of anti-theism, just let's just throw the vicars from the rooftops now, because it is time to end this thing. Not literally. Get off Twitter now, but.
That's a hashtag, if ever I heard one.
Yes. Your concern has been that, and I think Jordan shares this, that so much of what is good in our Western developed societies is, at the very least, maintained by maintaining so-called Judeo-Christian values, or the remnants of our past religiosity, and that there is a baby in the bathwater that can be difficult to discern, and we can't empty the tub all at once, and this is very much because there's a zero-sum contest with the religious enthusiasm we see coming from the Muslim world, and of course the Muslim world is all over the world at the moment. So in that contest between an older style of religiosity and theocracy really, and modernity, you are not as eager as I have been to pull up Western religiosity by the roots.
Or chuck the vicars.
Yes.
Yes, I think that's fair. I think I sit metaphorically as well as literally between the two of you. I realized from our conversation in Dublin some of what your concerns are about what Jordan has been saying and what he is saying, and I share some of the concern. I said to you then that I used the analogy of what our friend Eric Weinstein recently described to me as Jesus smuggling. That it was a consequence of a discussion about biologists. What do you do if you're discussing design, intelligent design? You can be okay as long as your own bandwidth on the issue, as long as your own depth of knowledge on the issue is very considerable. You can be okay discussing that biology with somebody, even a fundamentalist Christian, so long as you can follow every step of the way. But the fear will always be that the moment you're not looking, they're going to smuggle Jesus in. Or they'll wait till the moment that you're not comfortable anymore with the argument, the bit when you're at the very end of your cognitive ability, and then they'll, trust me.
There's Jesus. Yes.
There's Jesus. Yeah. And one of the things I realized from Dublin was, although I think you may not think that Jordan himself is going to try Jesus smuggling on you, you fear that somewhere down the line from what he's saying, somebody else will do that trick.
Yeah, it's worse than that. I actually know the people, the people who are clapping are doing that. I hear from those people on a daily basis, right? So that the segment of Jordan's audience that is very happy to be told they can stay on the riverbank of their traditional Christianity for the most part, and they don't have to get into the stream of totally modern, rigorous, rational thinking about everything from first principles, right? That there's something that the Iron Age scribes got right, and it's right for all time. Those are the applause I'm hearing. However consciously or not, Jordan is telling them it's okay to stick right there with a shard of the cross